Hey, welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast. My name is Mike Indovina, and thanks for hanging out with me today. In today's episode, I'm interviewing Doug Weier. If you're not familiar with Doug, Doug is an engineer based out of Tennessee who has worked with a ton of artists, especially in the Christian world. He's really well known for that, but he's worked with a bunch of artists in different genres. He's worked with people like the Maine, Josh Ross, Manifest, and so many more. And in today's episode, we get into a lot of conversation around how he goes about making his mixes feel really wide. Now, one of the things that I always do every time I'm interviewing people is I love to listen to people's portfolio and get a sense of what are the commonalities in their mixes. As soon as I put on his Spotify playlist, I was just engulfed in his mixes. They sound so big, so wide. And as I say in the interview, it felt like I was listening to immersive mixes because I was hearing things that were moving around and it just felt like I was right in the mix. And so I had to ask him all about how he goes about doing that. And as you'll hear in this interview, he has a lot of different little tricks that he does, but we get into what really matters. Sure, there's a lot of tricks you can do, a lot of plugins you can use, but what really matters? What makes the biggest difference? So in this episode, we dive into that so that you can take what he shares here and definitely help to make your mixes feel a lot more wide, a lot more polished as well. So we definitely get into how he makes things sound wide. We get into how he gets a big balanced low end. We talk about our go-to reference tracks that we like to use and why we use them. We get into so much good stuff in this interview. So I definitely can't wait for you to dig into this one. So with that said, let's just jump right in. Doug Weier, thank you so much for being on the MasterYourMix podcast. What's going on, man?
What's up, man? Thanks for having me.
Of course. For people who might not be familiar with you and your background and who you are, what you do, and ultimately how you got into everything, can you give us that story?
Okay, so I'm a mix engineer. So I got started maybe about, 7 or 8 years ago, started on Sound Better. Well, even before that. So I started out as a producer, and I think just an inspiring part about my story is I got a mix back that I did a production for this smaller artist, got a mix back from his mix engineer, and it was offensively bad. And in that moment, my life changed and I became a mix engineer. I decided if that guy calls himself a mix guy, I am too. So ever since then, I've been dedicated to making people never feel like I did when I got that trash mix back. So that's when it all started. Obviously starting out new, having very few clients, I found about Sound Better and it took maybe 3 months to get approved. But once I got approved on there, it started really going hard because I was one of the, cheap guys. So this is 2016 and started really getting booked out and, just doing hundreds of mixes, probably 200, 300 a year, and just cutting my teeth and honing the craft of people say you can't polish turds, but I polished turds and I made them sound so beautiful. At least that's what I think. But that's the boot camp for being able to be a modern take on what a mix engineer is now. Because sometimes you really do have to fix stuff. And oftentimes, back in the Sound Better days, I haven't been on there for a bit, maybe 6. It's probably a short stint, whereas 2 years of going hard and then kind of picked up into label stuff, which is kind of another story point. But I would replace drums, obviously, people do that, but I would replace bass. I'd have, I remember using Native Instruments, the Scarby bass guitar. And then I had this, it's a very EDM-y type of time. So I had this Serum preset that was a Reese bass, but it was so perfect. And I would replace stuff, literally reprogram the MIDI and then sub basses and all that stuff. So figuring out, how can I make this sound good, and if it can't be done by mixing, then literally redo it.
Yeah, I love that, man. It's an interesting thing to bring up, and something that I don't think a lot of people have brought up on this podcast, if at all, which is that idea that sometimes you have to polish those turds. You're going to get songs that sound bad, and I think that a lot of people when they're getting started just feel like the role of the mixing engineer is just to work with whatever you're given, and I think that there's probably a deeper conversation that needs to happen with the artist when you're mixing with them to know, like, what degree are they expecting you to polish their stuff. And in some cases, like, you have to replace the drums, or you have to add some extra tracks in there and that kind of stuff. Because, there's only so far you can take it. And I think when you're getting started, you're especially in the beginning, you're really trying to focus on building a portfolio of stuff that sounds good. And if you have a way that you can make it sound better, like, why wouldn't you do that, right? And sometimes it takes an extreme way of doing it.
Yeah. Well, we all know the story of the crotchety mix engineer where it's like they get subpar tracks and like, I can't work with this, But I feel like a lot of guys who are taking a step up today they're being the solution and not being a problem. But
I do think that there are a lot of people that still have that idea that, like, mixing is just working with the tracks that you have. And ideally that is the ideal situation where you get good tracks and there isn't any more work to do. But when someone's trusting you to make it sound the best it can, sometimes you being that third party objective person who isn't married to the songwriting, that kind of stuff, like, you come into it with a different perspective, and sometimes you may have that solution, and it might require muting something or adding something. It's kind of like in mastering in a lot of ways, where, like, we look to mastering engineers for their third party objectivity because they've never heard the song before. So, everyone in the chain really can add something to the process. It's just a matter of, I think, having those lines of communication to know, like, how far can we go with this, or what is the expectation?
Yeah. And it makes me think about, like, this level, the modern job of what a producer is more of a mix engineer. But, like, a lot of the stuff I get now, it's me very desperately trying to figure out how can I make any little improvements to this. So it used to be, how do I take this garbage and make it sound passable or like amazing? And now it's like, number one, how do I not screw this up because it's all put together so well? And how do I make the slightest little improvement, or a big improvement, as much as, like, how can I take this song as far as it can possibly go? And so now there's, like, this new way of, it's kind of like the mixer has become the mastering guy. And that's what I feel like a lot of the time, because I'm getting a session and it's pushed to the limit. There's literally no more room in it. Obviously I can turn it down a dB and find some space to work, but it's become all these little tiny, like, hacks that I've discovered or developed or heard from friends. Like, for instance, one of my buddies pointed out to me K-Clip by Kazrog, and it does this thing, like, I can have a mix where I hit a wall and it's like, how can I take this much further? I'll put K-Clip on, find a good spot in the mix bus chain to, like, get it gain staged right. And when I put tape mode on, it completely opens up the mix where you get, like, more perceived low end and more perceived top end. I don't know if it's actually adding, like, on a EQ basis, but it's, like, adding harmonics in a way that's like, wow, this polished it up that much more. That's, like, the new mix engineer role, is finding all these little hacks and optimizations within what people are doing, so we don't lose the vibe and we can, take this a step forward, which, like, the producer's done everything they could possibly do. They don't know how to make it any better, which is why, sending it to a third party, a guy who's going to obsess over it till it's actually the best it can be.
Yeah. I do think that it's important to touch on that topic of, like, hacks, because a lot of people listening to this are in that home studio world and maybe just getting started. And I think that there are a lot of people, especially when you're early, that, like, rely too much on the hacks as opposed to focusing on, like, the basics as well. Like,
very true.
Hacks are, like, kind of a last resort kind of thing, but, like, focusing
out
on
of
your basics, focusing on those basics, focusing on getting good tones at the beginning, good performances, all that kind of stuff, that is going to go way further than finding some plugin that makes a 0.5% difference to your mix, like.
Yeah, that's so true. So, like, I'm not, like, a gatekeeper with this type of stuff. So I'll tell my producer friends little things like that. And I'll see in the next mix session I get, they'll use one of these little hacks that I told them about. And it's just funny that it's like, there's still way more I can do. Like, it didn't do what it does when I mix it, because I'm using it where it's like there's literally no more that can be done. But when they're using it, it's like there's so much more optimization that can be done at a track level. So it's almost like it never works the same way. So yeah, getting the arrangement and the tracks optimized to work, it's kind of hard to describe, but yeah, getting tracks as fat or as big, as wide, as huge as you possibly can before you start throwing a bunch of crap on. Because a lot of times, I've seen producers using these like Jason Joshua templates or the Michael Brower templates, and it's like it still doesn't sound very good. Let's take all this stuff off, and yeah, it just levels up so much because the tracks weren't optimized. So that definitely is something to focus on way more than mix bus or group buses, all that type of stuff. 100%.
Yeah, I think it's so easy for people to rely on a specific plugin and hope that that's like the magic bullet for it, or like you said, like using templates and stuff like that. But those things only work if you feed them the right stuff. And I think that's a big thing. You kind of touched on width, which was something that I wanted to ask you about anyway. Like when it comes to your mixes, like, dude, you do an amazing job of making your sound, your mixes sound wide. Like, I feel like your stereo mixes feel like they're immersive mixes. Like I was listening to your Spotify playlist the other day, and I was like, holy shit, man! Like you're like things are happening all around you. It's awesome. I love it,
man. Thanks.
And so I'm curious to know, like, on the topic of optimizing your tracks, maybe let's just start there. Like, what role do you think that arrangement plays in allowing you to make a track feel wide?
It's everything. Okay, so for example, I'm working with this song the other day, and the kick sitting like, I don't know, like low 50s, and it feels a certain way. And then I pull in a reference track, and the kick is like literally kind of hitting around low 40s and 30s, and it feels huge, and it feels so much louder to me, that reference song that I'm listening to. And I pulled in another kick that was kind of more in that range, and all of a sudden the song gets so much bigger just because of that because there's nothing going on at, mid 30 hertz or high 30 hertz, whatever. Because nothing's going on there, and I have a kick there that fills up that space, it becomes huge. It's all about having like literally the exact frequency ranges and the notes in the right spot. It's like not stacking stuff on top of each other so that it becomes small and constricted. It's having literally the parts play the right notes. So it all comes down to arrangement, in my opinion. And the songs that I can't get loud enough, because that's kind of what it's come to. I'm trying to match references for certain loudness levels. I notice when I can't get something loud, it's when everything's stacked all in the same spot. Maybe it's all like the low fundamentals of the guitar are around 200, when they should be like 150, like that type of thing. That's kind of the key to getting things loud and wide and feeling in their spot. But as far as like strict like width in a mix, I think it comes from whatever low mid elements you have, which a lot of times it will be guitars. I mean, this is the secret that I probably haven't told many people, but it's using ozone, exciter, triode mode, and like distorting the low end and letting it be super fat on the guitars. And, they say not to make like low end elements too wide. People mono that stuff. I totally don't agree with that. I'll put triode on the widest, like low mid elements, push it up till it, then you do have to clean up some mud, like 300, somewhere around there. And once you get the low mids, technically the loudest perceived part of your song, the widest part of your song, that's what creates this huge fat width, because I don't know, that's loudness to me comes from low mids. And if I keep those low mids wide, you'll sound like you have the widest song ever. And I copied that from, I think it was listening to some Serbian mixes. I noticed, I think on the Back Colors record, which is like 2017, one of the songs, I'm So Free, I think, there's like a heavy part, and the guitars, the low mids of them are just like crazy wide. So I kind of make that a focus to get energy and to get width. I focus on the low mids of those wide elements in the mix.
That's interesting. Yeah, like I haven't ever heard anyone explain width with saturation. You know, it's like the default when people have that conversation about width is like panning and reverb and delays and stuff like that. But saturation definitely adds an interesting element to it. So
yeah, well, the reason is because we're talking about guitars. Say the guitars by themselves, they don't have enough low mids. I need to make more. I need to like go so over the top. Guitars, a lot of the times naturally don't have that amount. So the more I can accentuate, the more low mids I can get, the more width I can get. So that's the reason for, you know, saturating or whatever.
So as far as adding saturation, then, like you talked about how you like to use ozone, but I imagine that any multi-band saturation tool could work. Like you could probably use Saturn or something like that from FabFilter.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I'm just really comfortable with what ozone does exactly. I've been using it for forever. The one thing I like about ozone over Saturn is depending on the type of curve or depending on the type of like saturation style with Saturn, it adds a curve, like an EQ curve, like a straight up EQ that's not saturation. So you can't just have it on and not be doing something. Like warm tape does a big low end bump, which I don't always want because I don't know it's happening, that type of thing. So that's why I stick with kind of a more, you know, flat process.
Gotcha. There was another thing you mentioned when you were talking about how you add your saturation that I want to dial back or go back to, which is that you made it sound like you typically would start with the loudest section of the song, or what you would what you would make as the widest section of the song. So is that typically your approach to mixing? Like, do you always start mixing at the loudest part of the song or the widest part of the song?
100%. Usually it's chorus 2, and that's the bulk of the mixing time, creating an amazing feeling chorus and just looping it, like working on it till it's right. And sometimes it takes, like I was working on one for like 4 hours yesterday, just literally chorus 2. And then I had to, you know, I'm 4 hours in and I got to look at the rest of the song. But yes, that's building from the biggest point, because that's your, you know, that's the part you got to optimize if it's your loudest spot. So I'm working into a limiter and carving away stuff that shouldn't be there. One way I like to look at it, like talking about harmonics. I know this is kind of like a tangent, but okay, so you know a power chord. You got the 1-5 octave thing. It's kind of like an entire mix is like a power chord, or at least the low end. You want a certain series of harmonics. So it's like your lowest fundamental is up this loud, and then the second or the fifth is like quieter, much quieter, and then the next one is louder than that. And together with that harmonic series, kind of like what you're doing with your EQ that you're painting for the mix, it creates this like heavy feeling. And using EQ and, you know, harmonic processes like R bass and all that stuff to create this kind of like, for lack of a better word, power chord sound of the mix that makes it as heavy and heavy, but not muddy at the same time, which is why, you know, certain harmonics are down, certain ones are up. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I think that's a really cool way to look at the EQ curve of a song as you're building a chorus.
Yeah, it's an interesting visual. It's basically just like, you know, another way of putting it is like you're essentially slotting in various instruments to fill out the frequency spectrum and making sure that everything is you have something that is in that lower range and something that's a little bit higher and something that's even higher than that, so that they all come together to fill it out, but they work together to make it feel balanced.
But to explain it better, it's like, you know, when you have a certain like level of low end and then you have a scoop at 300, like that type of thing. It feels different than when you scoop it at a different place like 500. Like it will feel heavier, like scooping the mids on a 5150 or that type of thing. You can create all these different feelings and energies by, you know, developing your mix in those spaces. And it's just crazy how many different like feelings and attitudes and amounts of heaviness and weight you can get just by changing what frequencies are emphasized and what frequencies are de-emphasized. Very theoretical, but
Yeah, no, that's really what EQing kind of comes down to, right? It's like it's not just about boosting or only cutting. It's really about kind of figuring out where everything needs to be and like where you need to slot space for other instruments to exist and how so they all come together. So yeah, it's interesting. So going back to how you typically would start with the loudest section or the widest section of a track. How much do you then rely on maybe using automation or further panning in other parts of the song to make things go from small to big, or if at all?
Usually when I'm looping a chorus, I'm looping chorus 2 because I still want to like take it a step further in chorus 3, and I think it pushes me to like have something really big, but then have to go even further and kind of scramble a little bit. But when I go to a verse, it's kind of a disaster, and I have to do so much work. So, so much automation is involved at that point where I gotta do crazy stuff. But it's all based off of this static mix that happened when I was mixing chorus 2. Obviously, I'll go back on vocals and automate, word by word, S by S on choruses. But it's pretty static with chorus 2, and then from there it can get crazy. But once you base things on chorus 2, then everything else, you got to figure it out from there, which involves so much automation and heavy lifting other places.
Yeah. And I guess it would obviously be dependent on the source material too. And I find that, like, going back to the arrangement conversation, like a lot of people, they do tend to build their mixes so that, by chorus 3, there's like even more background vocals and all this other stuff. So naturally that kind of makes chorus 3 just sound bigger because you already have like more context there, right? So yeah, it's an interesting spot to start at number 2, because then you can how to make things smaller or let it go bigger. So it's kind of like a good spot to start.
Chorus 3s are really hard, but I think if I didn't do it that way, my chorus 2s wouldn't be as massive. If you start with chorus 3, you go back to chorus 2 and you're like, it's just kind of lame. Because the more stuff you have to pack in, it's almost like I want to be at the max and I want to have to kind of like desperately figure it out to make it as over the top as it needs to be. Because, chorus 3, I got, I do a lot of different styles of music, but there's always ad libs. That's the hard part. Yeah. Any extra BGVs or like a whole new guitar part, that's like, oh gosh, how am I going to do this? Takes some, like, literally a ton of EQ automation, like ducking stuff out so that this one can come in. But that does push you to get the best sounding, loudest, most optimized mixes that make mastering engineers want to kill you. I'm pretty sure every mastering guy hates me.
Why? Just because you're going really wide, or?
No, I'm going. It's like there's nothing to gain by the time. Like, gotcha. I've pushed it to the limit. I've taken it back. I'm optimizing loudness. Like, so I'll do a couple prints at different loudness levels and match them with LUFs. So like this one will be turned down a dB. I'll match them with LUFs to see what Spotify is going to do, because it's going to play them at a similar LUF level. And if I A/B and like the louder one, the tone of it, I'll go with that. If I A/B and like the quieter one, which almost never happens, I'll go with that. Sometimes, but almost never. But at that point, it's like I've been working and automating into this ceiling, and I can take off the final limiter. But if the guy uses a different limiter, every decision was made into that one. So it just changes so much. So I think a lot of guys are doing the mastering the loud mix just out of like, it changed too much. It's kind of like producers do the same thing to me. It's as loud as it can go. I gotta do a small miracle here. It's just that's where we've arrived in 2024. It's like everyone's really good at their jobs. That's the thing. Like the producers are like sometimes I'll get a mix almost every day. It's like, how am I going to do this? How am I going to beat this? But always I, bang my head against it till I figure it out. And then it's the mastering guy's job to do the same exact thing. So that's why I think mastering guys hate me.
Fair. Yeah. Well, again, it maybe comes back down to like what we were talking about at the very beginning, where it's like having those conversations with the people that you're working with. It's understanding how intentional were the decisions that were made, and if someone is very intentional about using a limiter and making things sound a certain way, then the mastering engineer is going to have to respect that and work with it, whereas a lot of people don't really like, there are a lot of people who are maybe inexperienced and they don't do it with intention. They just have it on there. And then, they don't know that a mastering engineer can make it sound better, or they don't know that like the effect that that limiter is making on the entire mix. They're just like, yeah, I just throw this on because that's what I think I'm supposed to do. Right. So, I think it does come down to just having those conversations and knowing what is intentional, where is that room for improvement, what leeway do people have in the chain, and then you can go from there. Going back to the width stuff, obviously, we've talked about arrangement being a big part of it. We've talked about how you like to start from the second chorus, and how automation plays a role in that too. But where do things like reverbs or delays come into your chain when it comes to width, if at all?
I don't think that's something that contributes to the width at all for me. But because verbs are like, they're an atmosphere. They're kind of like, they take up a certain amount of the stereo spectrum, but to me, to my ears at least, not all the way to the sides. So I would say they're definitely falling in between the widest elements. And I would say like, I grew up on records that are very dry, and that's kind of the sound that I gravitate to. Even though I feel like we're in a time where things are not dry at all, so I've had to adapt. But what I hear in my head, like some of my favorite records, like one that I played a billion times, System of a Down, Toxicity.
Love
like the
record.
driest thing of all time. Sounds amazing. That's kind of where I got my power chord theory about some of those like Andy Wallace mixes. That first Prison song, the jump, 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 jump. Everything, the bass, the guitar, and everything works together to create this, like, I think he describes it as a freight train type of thing, where the kick and the bass, it's all one kind of like moving part. And it is like, it feels like a mix that's a power chord. It's nuts. But anyways, I gravitate towards drier stuff personally. So I don't put a lot of thought. Like I've had the same, it's a good reverb preset, but I've had the same reverb preset for I think 7 years. Valhalla Room, the stock setting, which is so fine, but it's like EQ'd. Man, I'll try new reverbs, like the Seventh Heaven one, but I always come back to that. As far as like a medium room, or no, actually it's kind of like a long room. I haven't found an in the box like plugin that I've liked better than that one. And then everything from there is like tailored to song, but yeah.
Well, I mean, it makes sense that like once you found a tool that you really like and that you're comfortable with, like that just becomes part of your template. It becomes part of your process. And I would argue that makes you probably a better mixer because of it, because you're not having to go through a million different reverb presets and seeing, like you lose perspective.
I used to go through reverb presets and it was such a drag. Yeah. I will say, I don't have a template. Well, I guess I technically have a template. The only thing that's the same in my template is that reverb setting. Nothing else. Everything is so tailored, and I'll have presets and plugins, but that's the only thing. Yeah. I don't like templates because every time I've ever mixed an album and done one song and then pulled all the things over, it never turns out as good as that first song. So it inspires me to like, if that's going to happen, I want every song to be amazing. So I'm going to literally start from scratch, using that song as a reference, but not using the same exact plugins. And I have no idea why that doesn't work. Seems like it should, but it never does. Well, arrangement. That's why.
Yeah, I guess arrangement would have a big part to do with it for sure. And also, I mean, there is something to be said for, personally, I'm a big advocate for using templates, but I do understand what you're saying there with, whereas like with a full album, if you kind of base everything off of one song, then like a lot of those decisions that you put early on into making that first song sound the way it did, like you're kind of eliminating those decisions. And sometimes that's a good thing. But sometimes it can also paint you in a corner where you're, you know, you're like, oh, this is just where the tracks are supposed to live, and I'm not going to mess around with the volume balances between the kick and the bass or whatever it is, and you know that can be limiting in that sense. So it always does come down to just ultimately serving the song and figuring out what's best for it. And if a template helps you get there faster, then go for it. But if it's causing you to ignore decisions that are important, then that's problematic for sure.
Yeah, I feel like that's what it like. I can either be my normal like creative self, or I can get into that like Excel spreadsheet mode where it's like copy this, copy that, and it just like doesn't. Personally, for me, it makes me a worse mixer. So I kind of like did away with that. Plus, it's kind of boring. Like I was watching this, you know, YouTuber. He was talking about having the same process every time. And I've never done that ever. I will literally start with something different every mix. Sometimes, actually, lately I've not been starting with drums at all, which most people do. I'll start with the musical elements first, or the vocal first, or just bass, like bass guitar or the sub stuff, and kick together. But yeah, I think you just got to do whatever produces the best result for you, and not listen to all these, you know, YouTube tutorial stuff. I just feel like if I'm doing the same thing, I just get so bored and I stagnate, and everything's going to sound the same, or like slightly worse versions of what I did yesterday. So I like to always shake it up and kind of like remain in this slightly uncomfortable place where it's like, I don't know what's going to happen. I hope it works out. I feel like creating those, you know, uncomfortable situations pushes you, keeps you out of your comfort zone so that you can, you know, overcome and make the best mixes. I don't know. I might be crazy for that, but
no, I see what you're saying. And I do agree that like I would say that the reason why you are so good at that is because you have that experience. You have that knowledge of how to use those tools. So even if you go veer off course, you still know how to use those tracks. You're using your ears, you know how to manipulate things. Whereas like when a lot of people are getting started, like they may not know, you know, what order to, or what plugins to use, or how to adjust EQ properly, or maybe have a certain order of tracks, and you know, like what their process is. So it can help, I think, in those early stages, especially to have like a solidified process that you can maybe do in every mix. But as we talked about already, like arrangement's going to change, and you know, like things can happen that make a mix sound different, or that force you to have to think differently. Maybe you have to polish a turd, and that requires you to take a different brain, like think differently about the mix and how you're going to treat it. And so your traditional way might not work. You know, maybe you do need to lean more on drum samples or whatever it is. Yeah. So yeah, I think it works both ways. It's kind of like you need to know the rules in order to be able to break them, right? That's kind of the common saying.
Totally.
Right?
Well, and that reminded me, here's something that no one ever talks about, especially like, you know, a mixer who you look like you have it all together, you know what you're doing. Mixing is really hard. It's really hard for all of us. Like,
of course.
The reason it's hard is because you can be mixing something for hours and for whatever reason not realize that something completely sucks. And once you pop it onto a second set of speakers, you're like, how did I not notice that? So you're always in this place of, I think the best mixers are very like, if this sounds good, I'm a little skeptical. Does it actually sound good? Let me let me try to make this thing sound horrible. One of my favorite purchases that I've made in maybe the last couple months, well, it's not true, but it's these $10 the brand ONN on Walmart speakers, and I have them as a separate output, and I'll play the mix I'm working on these terrible sounding, like they sound like Bluetooth where they have that digital 7K. I'm trying to find out ways that my mix sucks, because I feel like every step of the way, with how many tracks you got to deal with, how many processes you got to keep in mind while you're going, you're going to miss something. And you could miss something pretty obvious, and kind of shaking up your perspective and finding out what's the worst this mix is going to sound like. And I find that out by putting it on those speakers. And I just find that so helpful. And I hope people are encouraged, like people who are frustrated with their mixing. I hope people are encouraged knowing that it's hard for everybody. Even the best mixers, I think they are the best mixers because they obsessively figure out how to do it. It's not because, I mean, obviously there's a ton of talent involved, but more likely it's because they're committed to excellence. And it's sometimes what I do is not fun, but I get what I think are really good mixes through this process. It's not fun to like have to struggle and fight a mix till it actually works out. It's kind of miserable. I feel bad about myself all the time because of this. And that's why, mixers are probably the glutton for punishment type of person. But that's why we exist, is because we will figure it out, like no matter how long it takes.
Yeah. I think we're like puzzle people, you know. It's like
exactly.
We enjoy those little details and trying to figure out how to make it all work together. And even if it's
why isn't this working?
Like, yeah, right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, so then speaking of that, like, do you use any reference tracks as you work? Like, are you using that to help calibrate your ears to make that process any easier?
1,000%. I was watching a Pensada's Place thing where Dave said, if I don't use a mix reference, I'll end up with something totally unusable. And I find that to be true. Like, you have to ground yourself. And I mix it. Actually, I really only mix at 2 volumes, very quiet or very loud. And I find that sometimes, some mornings, my brain will just be calibrated wrong, and I'll put bass up so high in my quiet mix, and then I'll pop on a reference song and I'll be like, whoa, okay, let's get back to reality. It's just everyone needs a true north. And I feel like if you don't have a reference that you know well, like Dave said, you probably will end up with something completely unusable.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. I definitely noticed that. Even like with my monitor controller, like I've got it marked off like my 2 listening levels, and I use the same reference track for every song just because like I know it so well now that I just can't listen to anything else, right? So which one's your reference track?
I want to. Oh, I'll tell you. I feel like I've said this on every podcast ever, but it's Rude by Magic, because it's like
nice. That's a great sounding mix.
It really is. It's like the most pop version of a live band thing. And in my opinion, it's as bright as you want to go in the 2K and up area, but it's also it's so fat. Like the bass is huge. Like very kind of like R bassy, where it's very resonant, and it just sounds good on every speaker I've ever listened on. It sounds even good on these Walmart on speakers, which is
that's your test, right? Like if it sounds good on those, yeah.
Yeah. What's yours? I'm curious.
So mine, because I work on a lot of pop punk stuff. Mine is a Blink-182 track called "She's Out of Her Mind." It's like on one of the recent records that I think, to me, I love the sound of that record. So like to me, I just listen to that all the time, and I've just become so used to it. You know, like to me, for the pop punk thing and the arrangements that I typically work with, it has all of the ingredients that I need there, and you know, I'm happy with that. So
yeah, that's awesome. I love that. Yeah. Some of the there's some Tomlin Algae mixes that I think are just unbeatable. But that would be more. I think is it Anthem Part 2 or no? I don't know Blink-182 that well, which is terrible for me. Stay Together for the Kids is what I'm thinking of. Those huge. The
power chords in the chorus.
He taught me about wideness. Tomlin Algae. When I listen to that mix and it opens up, it's just it's kind of unbelievable that something can sound that good. Like how he does it perfectly. He does it better than I'll probably ever do it. The wide 4 or 500 and lower on a guitar that makes it just kind of like outside the speakers. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. And he's also another guy who like isn't afraid to mess with the arrangement, isn't afraid to like mute things and stuff like that. So maybe this is all making sense here, right? This whole conversation is coming together here. But but I think it's true. It's like, you know, you need to be able to play with that arrangement, strip things out to make something sound big in another part of the song. So there's that, and just like the layering and all that. So yeah, like his mixes, I've always been a big fan of his mixes.
Yeah,
they sound great.
For real. I didn't realize, I thought maybe you did like heavier music. I didn't know you did mostly pop punk, right?
I do a lot of pop punk. I do a lot of heavier stuff as well, and I enjoy both of those. Like,
I've been really getting into pop punk stuff. I just mixed an album for a band called Real Friends. Their album is Blue
that
Hour.
record sounds amazing, man.
Yeah, I'm so excited about it. There's two or three songs out now, but it's out in October. I'm so pumped for people to hear it. Not because of the mixes, but the songs. I feel like they're pushing that genre further. Like it's like nothing I've ever heard. It's the coolest stuff ever.
Yeah, they're great. They're great. Well, another Tom Lord Algae thing that I was curious to ask you about when it came to width as well is like he's definitely someone who likes to use a lot of modulation in his tracks, especially with like background vocals and stuff like that. And I was curious to know about that when it comes to your tracks too. Like I feel like I can hear a lot of modulation or maybe some chorus effects and stuff like that on your tracks. Is that something that you actually like to use?
If I'm like, I don't think about it a lot of time, but if I'm like, I want to make this mix so cool, and I'm thinking about that from the start, I will get the micro shift going and do a parallel and push some background vocals into it. But I think the cherry on top of the wideness thing that we've been talking about is Ozone Imager 9, not 10, because 10 does not do the same thing, which is crazy. But there's this thing that happens when you put Ozone 9 on like maybe 100 hertz to up to 300, and you just like push it out 20%. It's so weird because it's almost like you're EQing more low mids, but it doesn't get any muddier. And that can't happen with EQ. Yeah, I can't just push up 200 and it stays just as clear, but gets fatter. So it's almost like an EQ move that creates a whole like world of space in that area and opens up kind of the center too. It's the weirdest thing, but that's a huge part of what's happening. And it might sound like more modulation and more reverb and that type of stuff. But I think that's probably a big part of the wideness equation.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about doing it with the low end, because I've always enjoyed the Ozone Imager for like, because it gives you what, like 4 bands, I think it is. I've always done like the second from the right, like not the ultra high end, but like probably more like the 2K range, and I'll boost that just ever so slightly. And like I've always found that does something really nice too. But man, now I got to go back and play around. It definitely does.
It's like you get to choose one, in my opinion. Like, where does your width come from? And some people do hear width on the sides, or sorry, width on the high end and upper mids. I hear width. That's another like complete conundrum, like to think about. The way people hear differently is crazy. Like you're tuned into upper mid things that make you feel it's wide, and I'm tuned into like lower mids that make me feel wide. And we're both not right or wrong, but that's how we're perceiving that sort of thing. It's just, it's funny.
Yeah. But also, like, you know, you kind of brought up an interesting thing when you were talking about how you use reverb and how you don't go 100% left and right with it, which I think that is maybe an area that a lot of people, like by default, you know, they put a stereo track on and it goes 100% left and right and they leave it at that. And thinking about it even further, you know, it kind of makes sense why I feel like your mixes are wider, because when you have reverb 100% left and right, it's really washing out a lot of that far side stuff, right? And So nothing can really stand out when it's just being swallowed up by reverb on those sides. So by
Totally.
going a little bit inward, it does leave room where like the mix still feels wide, but then when you have those elements that are kind of dancing a little bit more on the fringes, like that does give you that extra perceived width with it, which I
Totally.
think that's really interesting.
Yeah, that you got to think about a bunch of the things that are like left-right pairs in your mix, like overheads, guitars, heavy guitars, and then lead guitars, and verb sense. But just using that S1 stereo imager thing from Waves and kind of narrowing things slightly does a huge thing for making certain elements feel insanely wide. Like narrowing overheads just a touch and then letting the guitars be so fat on the sides and then narrowing verbs or widening verbs depending on what you want. But yeah, that stuff, having little pockets where things live is huge.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting because again, yeah, like I've always kind of defaulted to hard left and right with overheads and hard left and right with guitars, but then things are kind of living in that same area, and so I can understand how they, if you're hearing them throughout an entire song at full width, they can't go any wider when you want it to have more excitement, right? So it's kind of interesting to talk about bringing things in a little bit, and I think that makes a lot of sense. And also, like, it's not like you're hearing, it's not like you're hearing things automating a lot throughout a track. Like, you probably have your standard elements, like your overheads, for example. They're playing throughout the entire song. It kind of like, what would you say? Like, do you pan them in at like 75% or something like that? Or
it's hard to say if I'm using that Waves thing because maybe it's like a 70 numbers, right? Or something like that. Yeah, or numbers that make sense to me.
Yeah. But yeah, I guess if you're hearing those things that are playing throughout the entire song, then it's not like you're hearing a lot of things bouncing back and forth and getting bigger and smaller. It kind of just would really depend on the arrangement. So yeah, man, that's really interesting.
With that wideness trick, I'm usually the ozone wideness thing. I'm usually keeping it at 0 during the verses and then opening up in the chorus. So there's a couple things that I do that kind of like take the chorus up a notch, whether it's just straight up volume. I always end up liking the tone of like how hard the limiter hits in the verse. So I don't want to automate before the limiter. I do post limiter. So my waveforms look super weird. They look like a tiny brick and then a big brick. And I've never seen anyone else do that. It's funny.
So when you do the imager thing with the S1, is that typically something that lives on your master bus, or is it something that's more on instruments?
Instruments, definitely. Yeah. I have used it. Like, it's not terrible for mix bus, but it doesn't do the ozone thing, the low mid widths. It kind of like the wider you go on that, it kind of thins a track out to me on the S1. I use it more for narrowing, actually.
Yeah, I feel like the wider you go with it, the more you hear those phasing effects that it's doing in the background.
Totally.
Right? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Dude, like I said at the beginning of this, like when I listen to your tracks, the width feels so immersive, and so that's why I'm like hammering you about these questions, because I'm very curious to learn more about your process.
Well, there is, as we're talking, there's more that I'm thinking of. Like on that Blue Hour record from Real Friends, I had just started. Like the guitar parts are so good, I have to push them up, and sometimes they would drown out the vocal a little bit, and I got to figure out how to make that not happen while still hearing the guitar parts super prominently. And one thing that I figured out was, it's a dangerous tool, mid-side EQ, but if you use it in this pointed way where I take just the lead bus, like the stereo left and right, and EQ out the one note. Usually there's one note that's conflicting with like 800, 700 in the vocal. Only on the mids, there's this space that opens up in the center, and then it's like you get more stereo clarity between the two, and it plays better on, like, I have NS10s in the corner that are basically mono. They're so close together. It plays better on those. So it's like the best of both worlds. You get this even wider, clearer picture, but also it doesn't get as like clashy or cluttery on mono systems.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm assuming that when it comes to like low end as well, you're taking a lot of these similar approaches where like you kind of already hinted at this a little bit earlier, how you will sometimes just focus on those low end instruments and maybe rely on some saturation and stuff like that as well. So are there any other tips that you can can point us to as far as like getting big low end? Because that's another big element of your mixes.
Yes. Okay, this is actually like a really awesome trick that I mean, it's if you think about it, it's somewhat obvious, but it works so well. So like I have my reference mix, which is that rude magic thing, and I have this filter, and it's like based off of SonarWorks NS10 filter. So I just copied all the things and put it in ProQ. So it cuts off at like, I don't know if it's like 120, it's like really high. So 120 and down, you don't have to work with. And then it does kind of like a low mid bump and then rolls off. So I'll put that on and check how much bass I'm perceiving in that magic song. And I'll see where mine stacks up. And if my bass completely kind of falls away and it's like, oh, there's no low end now because it's sitting below that filter point, I'll bring in some R bass, usually R bass, sometimes max bass, and push that, literally just at 80, the default, and push that up until I start to perceive the bass the same. And it not only makes bass that translates, it just makes the fattest bass ever. You do end up having to EQ, like do a kind of sharp shelf down on the lows of like if it's a bass guitar. So like, I don't know, 60 and below, you can drop down 2 or 3 dB and it plays way better with the kick because the kick's hitting in that zone. So you're getting this more perception of bass, but less actual voltage of the bass and more space in the kick. And I'm all hearing this because I'm listening through that filter and kind of matching the reference song. But it's a cool trick.
Yeah, I love that you use that filter, but you said you have NS10s.
It's not the same. It's definitely not.
Yeah,
like,
it's totally different.
The filter sounds way worse than the NS10s, and it's way more constrictive. Like you just can't copy. I don't know. I've been doing that before I got the NS10s, so it's like I just found this. That's what mixing is. It's just finding ways of doing stuff that makes you make good mixes. Like that's a ridiculous little trick. Like
yeah.
Putting an EQ filter and listening that way, but like that's what I think gets me good low end.
But it's kind of no different than you listening to your Walmart speakers too, right? It's like you're finding a tool that has its own frequency curve and you're making it work on like potentially the worst sounding way people are going to listen to things. Yeah,
totally. But I think it's good to not have too many of those things. Like, I don't care what the bass sounds like on the Walmart speakers because you'll never hear it no matter what on any reference song.
And if you do hear it, you've gone too far.
Yeah, exactly. But having a few select points of view is super helpful if it's part of your system. Like that's definitely a huge part of getting my bass translation and low end. And there's something about energy that comes from like everyone wants the 50 hertz. The 50 sub, 50 and below type of thing, which feels very powerful when you have access to a loud version of that. But most of the time you don't. Even in a lot of cars, like my cars don't go, well, one of my cars sucks. Like horrible. It doesn't go much below like 50. And so where does the power come from? You got to get the power from that higher like 100 even like mid 100s area. And that's something I learned from I was really into when I was producing. I was so into Skrillex, and he has the just most massive R based out bass that I've ever heard. You can hear bass on everything because it's so harmonically rich.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I don't do the same filter thing where like I'll emulate a NS10, but one of my favorite plugins of all time is Metric AB from Plugin Alliance.
Oh yeah.
And in that plugin, they do have the option where you can isolate like the subs or the low mids and that kind of stuff. And I use that all the time, kind of in a similar fashion to what you're doing there too, where you're just really trying to focus on like, okay, the low end, like, can I hear it? Does it match as well as my reference track? And figuring out how to make it work within that frequency limited way of listening to your track. And, I do think that is a really helpful, useful trick for people to experiment with and just see like, can I isolate things and get them sounding as good in this frequency range, as opposed to focusing on, like, when you sometimes focus on the big picture, it can be very overwhelming, because you'll hear, like, you might go in thinking you're going to focus on low end, and then you hear something in the top, and that bothers you, and then you just become distracted. So sometimes just like taking it bit by bit and isolating those different frequencies can really be helpful for your focus.
Oh, 100%. That same principle is why I don't, like, I have Neumann KH310s, which, very full range. If I start a mix on those, it will be horrible. I have to start on something very dumbed down, which I have. I've been using the HS50M Yamahas since I started, 15 years ago. I'm so familiar with them. I feel like I know how to, like, I get really technical with stuff, but when I use those Yamahas, they just make me make the song fun and come alive. And then I can go to, like, what sucks about this, what's wrong with this actually, on a more detailed speaker. But yeah, you can really get completely lost in the details. The guys who use, the kind of like mastering mains to mix, I don't understand how they do it. It's just too much information for me, at least.
Yeah, there's way too much going on with those things.
Yeah. Totally.
But the funny thing is that, like, you hear, even though on those kind of speakers, like, you hear all of the details, a lot of those details that you can really identify with those speakers versus, like, your traditional studio monitors, they make the smallest difference at the end of the day. Like, the biggest difference really comes from focusing on, like, the mid range and making sure your low end translates on that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the big picture.
You can do that on most. Yeah, you can do that on most monitors, but then, yeah, you'll get maybe extra perceived depth or whatever it is off of, like, those really detailed ones.
Yep, that's why, like, the NS10s, I've been loving them so much lately. They're off to the side. They're not in my, which I think helps too. They make you fight for depth because they have none. I can't hear into them at all. But when I'll be like, I'll have a mix built and I'll be working in the Neumanns, making decisions, and then I'll flip it over there and I'll be like, oh man, there's some boxiness happening. Usually, like, 600 for me is probably where I'm missing. I don't know. Like, I don't think about that area, but the NS10s make me think about that. And I'll do literally one move on one track, and all of a sudden I'll pop it back over to the Neumanns, and this whole space opens up because I EQ'd, like, literally 1.5 dB on a guitar part. And it's, like, amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Love that, man.
Yeah.
Dude, I could chat your ear off about this stuff for so long. There's so much that I would love to pick your brain about, but I want to be really respectful of your time, so we should probably start to wrap things up. But
sure.
But first off, thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it. And
if
people want to learn more about you, or maybe listen to some of your work, maybe even work with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Probably just Instagram, Doug _ Weier, WEIER. Pretty chill.
Awesome, man. Well, I'll definitely include those in the show notes for people too, man.
Thanks. Cool.
Right on. Well, dude, thank you again for
one more thing before we go. It's just like, it's a really cool way to hear stuff. Like, if you have, a decent set of monitors, just going back to the width, really hearing that. At one point I put some, like, big tall panels behind the speakers, so there's no wall interaction. And then I moved my monitor down, and I got a sit stand desk and covered it with, like, an inch of rock wool, and, like, fabriced it. And I hear depth like stereo image stuff like I've never heard ever. So it's something to try out, like, getting your monitor out from in between your speakers and having nothing but, like, acoustic treatment behind them is, like, such a fun way to listen to music. And I think it's what inspires me to get the width and, like, really focus in on the stereo field elements. But I didn't want to finish the podcast without mentioning that.
No, that's a good point to make too. Like, for sure, all those reflections would have an impact on how you hear things as well. So yeah, totally. That's a good tip for people. Man, full of good stuff here. So, dude, thank you again for doing this. I really appreciate it, and I can't wait for people to hear
of course.
this. All right, man. So that was my interview with Doug Weier, and I really enjoyed that. I loved learning about his process and digging into how he goes about making his tracks feel wide. And I definitely took a ton of good stuff out of that. I loved how he focused on things like using saturation instead of EQ. I think that's a really unique approach in itself. But also, I liked how he talked about how panning can make a difference and how he will pan things often a little bit inward in order to make other things feel really wide. Now, that might seem super obvious, but so many people tend to follow a hard left, hard right kind of approach where they do like the LCR approach, and they'll go 100%. And then if that's the case, like how much further can you go, right? You've already maxed out your width. So it was kind of refreshing to hear him talk about how he doesn't mind going inwards a little bit in order to make other elements stand out. But I also thought it was really helpful to talk about how arrangement plays a big role in this stuff too. There's a lot of factors that go into making your tracks feel polished and feel big and have width and have movement. And it really does often start from the very beginning and focusing on getting those details like the arrangement and the performances and all that kind of stuff set up right so that the mix can fall into place a lot better. So I'm glad that we talked about focusing on some of those basics as opposed to just getting into a bunch of hacks, And yeah, he shared a lot of great tools that he uses, and there are definitely alternative plugins that you can use instead. But I think that as far as what's going to make the biggest difference, it really does come down to those basics and the like, again, going back to the arrangement and the basic tools like panning. Those things will make a much bigger impact than playing around with some of these imaging tools that can add something, but they're limited in what they can do. They can't polish a turd, as we talked about earlier in this episode, right? So with that said, I really enjoyed that episode, and I definitely recommend you check out his mixes. They were really exciting, and it's not very often that I hear mixes that like really blow me away. I was listening to his playlist, and there were a ton of songs on the playlist, and just one after the other, they all sounded huge. So I was really excited to chat with him to learn more about his process, and definitely I thought he did a great job of explaining what he does and why he does it, and how he mixes with intentionality, which is ultimately a big thing. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please make sure to subscribe to the podcast. That way you're notified about all new episodes as they're released each and every Wednesday morning, if you're not already subscribed, which you should be. And also, if you're struggling with your mixes and you're not quite sure what you can be doing in order to get more clarity in your tracks, if you have been spending a ton of time on your tracks, but they just seem to kind of hit this plateau where they're never really getting any clearer or bigger, and you're not sure what steps you need to get them across that finish line and to make them sound as good as your favorite recordings, well, then that is exactly what I'd love to help you out with inside of my coaching program, Amplitude. And inside of this program, I work one-on-one with my students to help make sure that what you hear coming out of your speakers is exactly what you always heard in your head with your songs, and that you have a clear process to follow from beginning to end, knowing what steps to take, what tools to use, what to be listening for, how to dial in the right settings. That way there's no guesswork, there's no feeling lost or overwhelmed. This makes the process really easy and gets you results. And then as you implement everything, you get direct feedback on your tracks as well, so that you know whether you're implementing it correctly or if there's any tweaks that need to be made to help make your song actually cross that finish line and finally get it done and sounding pro. So if you're interested in learning more about this program, make sure to visit MasterYourMix.com/amplitude, and you can find all the details on that page there. And I'd love to hop on a call with you to learn more about you and your goals and your current processes, to see what's working for you, what's not working for you. That way we can make a custom tailored program that's going to give you the most relevant stuff to your needs so that you can see results fast. And that's exactly what this program is all about. So once again, if you're interested in learning more, make sure to visit MasterYourMix.com/amplitude, and you can find all the details there. And with that said, we've reached the end of this episode. Thank you so much for sticking around to the very end, and I can't wait to chat with you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. Please make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave a review. If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, send an email to questions@masteryourmix.com. And for more information on how to create pro recordings from your home studio, visit MasterYourMix.com.